Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexandra Bell, and I'm the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. We're so glad to have you here today as we explore the current situation between Israel and Iran, a situation that honestly is changing by the minute. The Bulletin was quick out of the gate with coverage on this crisis starting late Thursday evening and continuing throughout the weekend. In the days ahead, we will continue to platform scientists and experts to bring you the latest fact-based analysis on this dangerous conflict with broad-reaching security implications. We've been covering nuclear threats at the Bulletin since the literal beginning of the nuclear age and are proud to be celebrating our 80th year. We've reached this milestone because of engagement and support of people like you. If you don't already support us, please consider subscribing to our bi-monthly magazine, our newsletter, or making a contribution on the site. If you already support us, thank you very much. Your support helps amplify the best experts in disruptive technologies, climate change, biotech, and nuclear risk. Just like we'll talk about in today's event, there's no doubt that one of the reasons the doomsday clock stands at 89 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been, is due in part to the long-standing and complex nuclear threats that exist in the Middle East. To help outline the current state of those threats today, we're very lucky to be rejoined by experts that helped explain the ongoing nuclear negotiations with Iran back in May. First, we have Kelsey Davenport, the Director for Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association. Kelsey focuses on the nuclear and missile programs in Iran and North Korea and on international efforts to prevent proliferation and nuclear terrorism. She's also the creator and lead author of the P5+1 and Iran Nuclear Deal Alert newsletter. Next, I am delighted to welcome Richard Nephew, a senior research scholar in the Faculty of International and Public Affairs and adjunct professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Important to know for today's conversation, Richard served as the Deputy Special Envoy for Iran in 2021 and was the Director for Iran at the National Security Council from 2011 to 2013. So let's get right in to this discussion of what's happened since last Thursday. Kelsey, we'll start with you. Can you outline for us the nature and significance of Israel's attack on Iran's nuclear infrastructure? And from your initial estimates, what effect will these attacks have on Iran's nuclear program?
Thank you so much, Alex, for hosting this important and timely event. And thanks to everybody for joining in. It's a real pleasure to be here. So in the first two rounds of Israeli strikes on Iran, several of Iran's key nuclear facilities were targeted. The most damage appears to be done to the Natanz facility. The Natanz facility includes both an above-ground uranium enrichment facility known as the Pilot Fuel Enrichment Plant. Iran enriches uranium there up to 60%, which is near weapons-grade levels, and a much larger below-ground enrichment facility where Iran was currently enriching uranium to about 5%. There are additional structures at that site, including an underground facility that could be intended for uranium enrichment. Now, it's going to be challenging to ascertain the full damage that's been done to this facility until the IAEA can get back into the site and inspect it. But it does appear that that pilot facility, again, where the 60% enrichment was conducted, that most of that was destroyed. The strikes also appear to have targeted the power supply to the facility. So as a result, centrifuges at the main underground enrichment plant could have been damaged. I mean, centrifuges, the nature of the design, the rotors spinning, so quickly within these machines are quite delicate. So abrupt changes to the power can cause them to spin out of control, even explode. So again, not clear what the damage will be to that site. It's also not clear what may have happened to the enriched uranium at Natanz. Were some of the cylinders destroyed? Did Iran manage to move any of the cylinders off-site, either before or after the strikes? So there's a big question mark about the location of the uranium. And again, some of that material is enriched to near 60% level. So it's quite critical, to determine, where that uranium is, in the coming days when we talk about proliferation risk. Now, another site that was severely impacted was the Isfahan complex. There are a number of facilities at Isfahan, some of which are subject to regular IAEA and safeguards because they include uranium. But it includes plants such as, where Iran is attempting to manufacture fuel for its Tehran research reactor, where it conducts uranium conversion activities, where it conducts uranium metal activities. And some of these facilities were damaged quite severely. Israel also contends that there are weaponization-related work being done at this site. U.S. intelligence has not confirmed this, nor has the IAEA. But again, some of those uranium conversion facilities were likely destroyed. There does not appear to be any damage to the Fordow site. Iran enriches uranium there, also to 60%. That site is deeply buried. It'd be challenging for Israel to strike with conventional weapons. But the IAEA notes no damage there. Iran's nuclear reactors, its power reactor at Bushehr, its research reactor, the Tehran research reactor, neither of those appear to be targeted. So one thing that I conclude just looking at Israel's strikes on Iran's program is that if there was truly an imminent proliferation risk, if Israel really thought that Iran was dashing towards a nuclear weapon, I think there would have been a much more sustained campaign trying to disrupt activities at Fordow and other activities at the Natanz site.
Thanks for that, Kelsey. You mentioned Natanz and Fordow having facilities that are underground and generally not suited to a bombing campaign. So to really disrupt the program, how would you actually even get at deeply buried sites?
Well, it's likely that Israel would need, U.S. support if it actually wanted to penetrate some of these underground facilities. I mean, the largest U.S. conventional bomb, the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, repeated strikes with that munition, could likely damage or destroy some of these facilities. The U.S. has not transferred that bomb to Israel. It's not clear if Israel's Air Force would be able to deliver it either, given the size. So it likely would need U.S. support. But even so, I think if Iran wanted to try to disrupt activities at these facilities, even if it couldn't destroy them, we'd likely see more focus on attempts, to disrupt, to damage, key access points if proliferation was really the driving concern here.
All right, now Richard, feel free to add anything to Kelsey's really great laydown of the attacks, but I want to move you in the direction of the Israeli approach didn't just target the nuclear facilities, but also their military structure and top military leadership, upwards of 20 if Israeli estimates are correct. Shortly after Israel's strike, Iran's supreme leader vowed severe punishment for Israel in a televised address. So a two-part question for you. What effects do you think these attacks have had on Iran's decision-making ability in terms of both short-term and long-term responses? And in terms of the kinetic response from the Iranians, some missiles have gotten through Israel's Iron Dome, and citizens around Israel have certainly endured, fear and been sheltering throughout the weekend. But how much effects are these Iranian attacks actually having? And are we seeing a limit of Iran's capacity to respond in a military fashion?
Great. Thanks for the question, and thanks very much for having me here. Yeah, just to add a little bit onto Kelsey's presentation, but it actually gets to kind of the question you were asking. I think one of the things we have to accept is that we don't know the totality of what the Israelis have in mind and what their plan is, and it's possible there are elements of it that we're not seeing yet. And I think we need to just kind of acknowledge that up front. I agree. I've been pretty outspoken in saying I am not only shocked, I'm quite worried about the absence of military activity around the Fordow site and some of the other tunnels and deeply buried spaces that are there. If you're going to do this, set aside whether or not you should do this, but if you're going to do this and you're not targeting those places, I'm really not sure I understand what you're doing. If you're trying to actually either prevent a nuclear weapons outcome, or if you're trying to at least trying to address it to some degree. I think what we've seen from what the Israelis have been doing is a multi-pronged approach that is clearly intended to go after the targets that are immobile and the things that make it very easy for Iran to resist. So in the first instance, they started targeting military leadership. They started targeting the people who were responsible for the missile force and therefore the retaliation structure that the Iranians have to go back at the Israelis, the people who are responsible for air defense, all of those sorts of folks and facilities that make it much more difficult for the Israelis to, operate over Iranian airspace. That was really the initial target set, which again makes some degree of sense if you're planning for a multi-week campaign as opposed to a dash-in operation. But it does, leave open the question of, okay, but when are we going to get at some of these other places? I think we've also seen an indication that the Israelis are hoping to create enough instability in the system that they might possibly precipitate a regime collapse. That may be more aspirational than intentional. They may hope that they're able to engender enough pushback in the part of the population, especially as people are, clearly scared and worried and angry at the government for getting themselves into this kind of situation. We've not really seen any indication of that happening yet. Of course, we're in early days, and people are right now much more concerned with preserving their own lives and those of their families too. So there's a possibility that regime change, at least is an intent, is an objective, is something further down the list, even if it isn't necessarily the first step. The Iranian response has been really two-pronged at this point that we know of, with the possibility of a third. The first prong has been diplomatic. So they've immediately, sent letters to the UN Security Council, immediately went to the IAEA, immediately went to states in the region and to other countries to say, basically, let's condemn this Israeli attack. They've not really gotten a lot of traction thus far. The presentations that were given at the UN Security Council were not terribly persuasive, or not persuasive enough in any event, to change the trajectory. Of course, they weren't going to be. There was very low likelihood that the US or other European countries were going to try and join the Iranians in condemning the Israelis at this point. But long term, as we've seen with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there may be a persistent value that's had for the Iranians in terms of reaching out to other countries to basically plead their case and to put the Israelis as the aggressor in the circumstance. They're the ones who launched attacks first, regardless of where the nuclear program might have been. The second big area of retaliation has been on missile strikes. So the Iranians have long had a stockpile of medium-range ballistic missiles, as well as others that they have threatened to use, and in this circumstance have been using against Israel. The Israeli interception force has worked reasonably well. Most of the missiles have not hit their targets. There have been some that have gotten through, though. And there's an open question in my mind, and I'm sure an open question in many folks' minds, of how much longer the interceptors can keep up with the missile rate coming in. These are not, infinite assets. The Israelis do not have the ability necessarily to keep up with the missile attacks if they're using more interceptors than the Iranians have missiles. And the interplay between missile launches and interception is something I think we need to watch very carefully. I'm 100% certain that the Israelis are watching this incredibly carefully to see what their risk profile is. And then the third big retaliation space is one that Kelsey's already kind of spoken to, but I'll just foot stomp, and it's what the Iranians might be doing with the enriched uranium. We don't know where it is. There have been a large number of centrifuges that have been produced in Iran that have not been accounted for, in part because of decisions the Iranians made to not cooperate with those elements of the JCPOA back in 2021 after Iranian centrifuge component workshops were attacked, most likely by the Israelis, although that's not been publicly validated. It's the allegation that's been in the press. It's the one that makes sense. But the fact that there are these centrifuges out there, the fact there is material that is out there, the fact that we know that the uranium conversion materials that were at some of the undeclared sites that have been subject to IAEA investigation haven't been found yet, all of that adds up to the possibility that there is a breakout activity that's ongoing.
Thanks for that, Richard. And we might come back to Endgame a little later in the conversation, but let's move to where the U.S. is and its perspective, where it stands. There have been some mixed signals coming from Washington. Initial comments from Secretary of State Marco Rubio about the attacks downplayed U.S. knowledge or involvement. President Trump seemed to assert that the United States did know about the plans, but was not involved in said plans. And even said that they advised Israel to delay any attack while, negotiations were still possible. Kelsey, let's start with you. How much knowledge and involvement do you think the Trump administration actually had here? Or is that something we'll find out in days to come?
Well, I think we'll find out with more clarity in days to come, certainly. But I think some of the actions of the Trump administration suggest that maybe they didn't have a whole lot of specific knowledge. I mean, we should keep in mind that the Trump administration was planning to send lead negotiator Steve Witkoff to Amman on Sunday to meet with the Iranians. I think the Trump administration clearly expected that the nuclear negotiations were going to continue. They had been in an exchange of proposals, about the terms of a deal. I think we should be under no illusions that a deal was anywhere close. But, negotiations were proceeding, the sides were talking. And one consistent through line for President Trump is his support for a diplomatic agreement and his opposition to any use of military force absent a clear move by Iran, towards weaponization. So I think it's likely that the Trump administration was taken by surprise by this. It does seem that in the aftermath of the attacks, Trump may be trying to use the strikes on Iran as pressure to try to get Iran to return to negotiations or to get Iran to agree to U.S. terms under a deal. I mean, I'm concerned about that approach. I mean, Iran typically does not respond well to pressure that's designed to translate into concessions at the negotiating table. So I think, I said, the U.S., likely thought that diplomacy was ongoing and was taken, somewhat by surprise. I think we are seeing now amongst certain factions of the Trump administration an emphasis on the need for de-escalation. And I think that's where the U.S. should really be focusing its diplomatic energies right now, trying to bring the immediate hostilities to cease, and then probing what may be possible on the path forward for talks.
Thanks, Kelsey. Richard, a lot of people have talked about the potential tension between interventionist and non-interventionist camps within the Trump administration. So what's your take about how that tension might play out in the days ahead? And also, how do you think Capitol Hill is going to respond to the potential involvement of the United States in this conflict?
Well, look, I mean, I think if you're, sit back and look at it for a second, I think that the restraint universe, non-interventionist, however we want to dub them, right now they're winning that argument. The U.S. has not intervened, and I think the president's making pretty clear that he doesn't want to intervene. That doesn't mean he will continue to have that stance. And certainly, he has been indicating a readiness to act if need be. And we're seeing this in terms of tangible assets that are moving towards the theater. So the Nimitz had left the theater, and now it is coming back. It is right now in the South China Seas area around Singapore. And so it's not going to be there tomorrow, but it's en route. A number of mid-air refuelers are also, flying into theater as well. So there is a space there for the U.S. to intervene. But I think right now, the president and large parts of the national security space, which mostly are part of the restraint universe, are basically saying, let's see what the Israelis are able to do. We don't have to get ourselves involved. We shouldn't. It's a regional problem, and a regional state is dealing with that regional problem. If we need to engage, we potentially will. I think on Capitol Hill, it's kind of a mix right now. I mean, there are certainly a lot of voices out there who are saying, listen, if the Israelis cannot knock out Fordo and some of these deeply buried sites, and they need the United States to step in, the U.S. needs to act. I don't think that's purely a Republican or a Democrat position. I think it's much more of an argument about whether or not you think that there's a diplomatic option at this point, and what the role of the U.S. is in trying to prevent Iranian nuclear weaponization. So I think that debate will continue to play out. I think the thing where I would be very surprised is if there were all of a sudden a congressional group that was coming forward and saying, the United States not only needs to be involved in dealing with Fordo and the deeply buried sites, but we need to full court press and get ourselves involved in this to deal regime change and similar, those sorts of steps. That seems fairly unlikely. I think if the U.S. were to get involved, it would be primarily to address the imminent nuclear challenge rather than anything else. But, as we all kind of keep alluding to, we're in day 4. of something that, even the Israelis are saying is going to take weeks, I suspect could last much longer than that. So I think we need to hold open the possibility that as we see things developing on the ground, potential war aims will change for Israel, potential U.S. aims and intervention could change, and certainly what the Iranians are prepared to do to retaliate. We haven't seen anything in the Strait of Hormuz yet. That may also affect our decision making.
I come back to potential actions in the region, but first, Kelsey, I know you've tracked activity on Capitol Hill with regard to Iran. What's your take on how the House and the Senate will respond to this?
I agree with Richard. I think this is an area where traditional kind of partisan lines don't necessarily apply, and I think we could see some very, strange for this day and age, bipartisan groupings forming along different lines. I mean, Senator Tim Kaine has already introduced a resolution that basically says that the Congress has not issued the authorization of military force for Iran, and that would, prevent the Trump administration from using, military assets against Iran. I think it's likely he'll get bipartisan support for that from some of the non-interventionist members of the Republican Party. But there are also those members of Congress who traditionally have been very hawkish on Iran, like Senator Lindsey Graham, who are calling for much more active U.S. involvement, including through direct military strikes. So I think it's going to be an interesting space to watch, and also a space that could change very quickly if there are, U.S. casualties, either, U.S. citizens in Israel, other military assets are hit in the Gulf, or if Iran's penetration of Israeli airspace changes. And if we see more direct strikes on Israel, again, all of that could change congressional feeling very quickly, I would think.
Yeah, thanks, Kelsey. That's a perfect segue into my next question. Iran has warned that even supporting Israel via a defense strategy would be viewed as an attack, with the UK, France, and US being specifically mentioned. So we'll start with Richard. Should we be worried about an Iranian strike on US personnel in the region? Would we have warning? I know we've already moved people out of embassies. Are we taking the right steps to prepare for such a potential attack?
I think we should be worried about it, but the fact is that as of right now, that's not what the Iranians have chosen to do. The Iranians have actually been fairly focused in their retaliation thus far on Israel, and I think they're trying to make the argument that this is a Israel-Iran conflict that they didn't ask for, but now they're stuck with, and so they're gonna prosecute it to their best ability. I think the chances of U.S. personnel being caught up into this obviously go up if the United States intervenes in a much more direct way in offensive operations. I think, thus far, defensive operations, while the Iranians have called them the same thing, they're not. I mean, I think there's a factual inaccuracy there from that standpoint, but it's also it's a question of capability. It's a question of resource. If the Iranians are firing things at U.S. bases that they could be firing at Israel, is that necessarily how they want to apportion their resources, especially if that runs the risk of them bringing us in? So I think a lot of this math changes if the U.S. gets involved in offensive operations, or if the Iranians become convinced that the only solution is to escalate, and that they fall into this doctrine that comes up on all sorts of circumstances of escalate to de-escalate. If that by threatening either transit through the Gulf or threatening U.S. bases, they can persuade the United States to intervene with Netanyahu and get him to back off, or similar sort of logic might pertain to Gulf Arab states. So right now, I think we can. I wouldn't say have confidence in, but I think we can at least appreciate that the Iranians have not chosen to do that yet, and may not choose to do that while they still feel like they've got other things that they want to use their resources for. But the long arc of a conflict that lasts weeks is going to change, and the target selection is going to change, especially if the Iranians decide their current strategy is not working.
Kelsey, what about other countries in the region? Are there trigger points that you worry about that could involve parties beyond Israel and Iran in this conflict?
Well, I think one interesting development that I would note is that several of the Gulf states were very quick out of the gate condemning Israel for these strikes, recognizing Iran's right to defend itself. And I think that suggests to me that there might be an interest in those states in that region to support further moves towards de-escalation. I think several of these countries recognize that they have critical infrastructure that is quite vulnerable. If conflict did expand, if it did widen out, that their oil and gas industry, say in Saudi Arabia, could be targeted. And I think so. I think too, if we look at kind of the longer arc here, we've seen the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, trying to strengthen its relationship with Iran, trying to move towards, rapprochement. So I think, we'll see these states continue to try to play more of a de-escalatory role and trying to avoid getting sort of directly sucked in. But also, I think we'll see rhetorical support, for Iran and continued condemnation of Israeli strikes that we're not seeing in other regions of the world.
Mm. Now, I want to take a step back into the days leading up to the attack. Prime Minister Netanyahu suggested that Iranians were very close to developing a nuclear weapon, close to a breakout capability, and close to breaking out fully. And the attack directly followed the public release of the IAEA assessment, which indicated Iran was not complying with its non-proliferation obligations. Kelsey, as someone who has read a lot of IAEA reports, can you give us an assessment of why this particular report was significant and where Iran is in terms of an enrichment capability that would allow them to have a nuclear weapon?
I would say if anyone was surprised by the contents of the IAEA report, they have not been paying attention. I mean, there was nothing significantly new about the findings in the IAEA report. For people like me who read a lot of reports, were there some interesting details? Yes, but there were no new significant conclusions. This report reaffirms what we have known for years, that Iran had conducted illicit nuclear activities prior to 2003. Some of them involved uranium. Some of them were directly relevant to Iran's illicit nuclear weapons program, and that Iran did not declare all of these activities and materials to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Is it concerning? Yes. From a safeguards perspective, is it problematic that Iran hasn't answered these questions? Yes, absolutely. But this is not a definitive indication that Iran has made the decision to develop nuclear weapons. Now, Israeli officials, including Netanyahu, have said that they had evidence that Iran was engaged in weaponization. If that is the case, it seems that they have not shared it with the United States because the U.S. intelligence community has continued to assess that Iran is not engaged in key weaponization activities. And they have not presented anything publicly that is groundbreaking. So where Iran's program was on June 12th, before the strikes, was that Iran could produce enough fissile material for a bomb in a matter of days. That's deeply concerning. That has been true for more than a year. And Iran could build a nuclear weapon. Estimates on that are harder to determine, months, probably closer to a year. But again, all of that has been known for years. So there's nothing definitive from the IAEA that really changes that assessment, sort of in my opinion. So if Israel has evidence that Iran was dashing for a bomb, like I said, I think it needs to come out more publicly and share that because nobody else is confirming that assessment, not the agency and not the US government.
Yeah, Richard, you've dealt directly with the IAEA on these issues. What was your assessment when you saw that report come out, and did you think it represented a significant change in the circumstances, one that would predicate the need for an immediate attack?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think two things can be true though at the same time, right? The Iranian nuclear program is a hell of a lot closer to nuclear weapons today than it was a while ago, and that is, as Kelsey said, independently concerning. So, the IAEA's report, and for that matter, the non-compliance resolution, are kind of being wrapped up into this as being the seed, for leading to this conflict. And I know that there are some delegations at the IAEA who are trying to say, well, the non-compliance finding happened, so that's the reason why the Israelis struck. I think both of those things are more coincidental. It is the timing that is bringing these things together, not necessarily the facts. It's worth saying, as Kelsey said, it's possible the Israelis have information they've not made available to the United States. It's possible they have information they didn't make available to the IAEA. It's possible they made information available to the United States that hasn't been made public yet. And it's worth noting that when DNI Gabbard was releasing her statement on this, it was 2 months ago. And, again, my experience in government is 2 months is plenty of time for things to change. When you thought you knew something, then all of a sudden information comes in that tells you something you didn't know. So, is it possible that there is this information out there? Certainly. I think the much more likely scenario is that given where Iran's nuclear program is, which is very unsettlingly potentially close to nuclear weapons, as Kelsey said, the estimates for how long it would take them to weaponize vary. I think it's right to look at a longer timeline for a missile-borne weapon. It is much shorter for something much more crude. That's something that's at least been discussed as a possibility, coming from press reports and others. And again, it makes sense. It's consistent with the math that we all know about. But I think the real issue is that the Israelis were concerned the Trump administration was going to make a deal that they didn't like, and that was going to box them in terms of dealing with the nuclear program in perpetuity. Whether or not that's a deal that any of us on this call would have liked is a whole separate problem. But I think that the question about whether or not there was a linkage to the deal, to me, I think is pretty clear that the Israelis were already quite concerned with the negotiations and the direction they were traveling. I think they had concern about the possibility of enrichment, not being a required dismantlement project for the deal. And, they looked at an opportunity that they potentially had and took it.
We've got a ton of questions, so I want to get to some of the questions coming from the audience, but we haven't talked yet about Russia and China and their role, of course, as a key part of what got us the JCPOA back in 2014. But how do you expect them to respond now? And then the very easy question of, what now for the diplomatic efforts? Are they, completely off now, or is this something that we'll have to see coming down, in the response to these attacks? So those very easy questions. Kelsey, why don't you tell us about Russia-China?
Sure. So I think there's been a lot of speculation about to what extent Russia is going to provide, military support in terms of equipment transferred, to Iran. I would not put, if I were the Iranians, I would not, invest a lot of my hope in Russia, coming to Iran's assistance. I think Russia views Iran as a partner of convenience. It is certainly benefited from Iran's support for its invasion of Ukraine, but I don't think we're going to see Russia being willing to send, military assets, particularly like the types of air defense systems that Iran would probably be trying to get to Iran right now. I think, China, we may be able to look to China to try to, support, some calls for de-escalation. I don't think China benefits from this conflict regionalizing in terms of damage that could be done to Chinese assets, to Chinese economic interests. At the same time, I'm not sure how likely we're going to see China, being proactive on trying to resolve any of this. One thing I think the U.S. would be smart to engage both Russia and China on is underscoring, even in a general sense, the opposition to any country withdrawing from the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. Of course, any country would mean Iran, but sometimes if you mention Iran specifically, it's more challenging to get, states on board. but any type of general support for the NPT, general opposition to withdrawal, outlining the consequences for withdrawal, because neither Russia or China benefit from further erosion of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and additional states considering developing nuclear weapons. So I would try to focus on engaging Russia and China in those areas moving forward.
Great. We have a couple questions online about the broader international community's reaction as well, whether it's in Europe or the UN, and generally why we aren't seeing a more aggressive call for diplomacy in these initial days of this conflict. Richard?
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with Kelsey with regard to Russia and China, and I also think that the Chinese position is going to be essentially linked to continued oil supplies and similar. This actually might be part of the reason why the Iranians feel some incentive to start threatening those as a way of trying to get the Chinese to weigh in and try and push back. I mean, again, this is where we're in day 4, but there's a counter move sort of element to all these sorts of things. On the issue of countries pushing for diplomacy here, look, I think there's 2 issues. Issue 1 is, the Iranians are not, by virtue of their actions and activities, especially on the nuclear side, but in other ways as well, terribly popular internationally, right? Whether or not countries are excited about the idea of Israel attacking Iran, I think there is a reality that the Iranians themselves have made it very difficult, I think, for countries to say that there isn't a cause for concern here, especially if you're Israeli. And I think this also features into the issue of the de-escalation dynamics and pushing for de-escalation. Now, this might not be a popular view. I will say it anyway. I think the problem with the de-escalation call at this point links back to what happens the day after that and what happens if the war ends while the nuclear program is where it is, and what our expectations are about what the Iranians do thus far. It's part of the reason why ringing the military bell is going to change the circumstances, and it's going to change the trajectory. It's my personal view that a diplomatic outcome is a lot harder to do now, and it's a lot harder to set up now, and it's a lot harder to verify now, because the Iranians have every single incentive in the world to continue towards breakout, including with secret sites. There's going to be basic facts the IAEA will not be able to ascertain, like how much uranium is still in various different places. As Kelsey said earlier, it's possible that some of it was destroyed. It's possible some of it was just hidden. And it's possible that it's a secret breakout site right now. And so this is part of the conundrum, I think, that's facing Europe. It's frankly facing even people who advocate for negotiated solutions, like myself here, is really trying to come to so what does the diplomatic outcome achieve? Does it achieve the Iranians getting time and space to break out? Does it achieve an actual long-lasting, durable deal? That seems a lot harder to do at this point. What are the terms for that? What does that look like afterwards? I think that's part of the reason why people are at this point trying to evaluate what is the situation going to be before they're in a position to say, okay, now we know what a deal potentially could look like. Now, I think generally speaking, people want to see the end of missile attacks on cities and civilians dying and those sorts of things. Clearly, that is something that people in both countries as well as the international community would support. But I think that's part of the reason why the international environment is so mixed at this point, is that people are trying to figure out what exactly that nuclear program looks like, what Iranian intent is, what a deal would achieve, and how it would actually be verified. All those things are a lot harder today than they were, this time last week. And I think that's part of the reason why also U.S. decision-making on this is going to be complicated. Just to foot stomp this point, there are lots of people who might have supported a deal who are now looking at this and saying, okay, well, but the circumstances have shifted now. Not because, great, the Israelis took out the program, but rather they've given an incentive structure to the Iranians that's kind of hard to push back on. And instead, you have to deal with the facts as they are and what the program, potentially will look like.
Alex, could I add a point?
Yeah, please.
So I certainly agree with Richard, and I think figuring out what the diplomatic path forward now is much more complex and challenging. But one thing I think is important to emphasize in the short term is, how do you get inspectors back into Iran's facilities to start assessing damage, to accounting for what they can? to perhaps expanding some monitoring outside of Iran's declared nuclear facilities to try to get a better picture. I think all of that can help arrest some of the concerns about illicit activity and weaponization, probably not all of it in the short term, but certainly it would be a promising step forward. And I think, the US, others should be willing to put something on the table, in return for Iran, opening up those sites. Top of that, there probably is going to have to be some more assurance that those sites are not going to be subject to further attacks, by the Israelis. I think the IAEA has to feel comfortable that its inspectors will be safe going back in. But I would try to start there with the restoration of IAEA access as an immediate first step as part of any call for de-escalation and return to negotiation diplomacy.
Mm-hmm. We've got a technical question that's come up twice, and I think it's an important one to cover. What are the potential dangers of attacking, even with conventional weapons, nuclear sites? And are there consequences to bombing facilities that have sensitive nuclear material inside of them? I think, just trying to give people an idea of the difference between a nuclear explosion and a bomb that explodes in a nuclear facility. Richard, I want to start with you.
Yeah. So look, the technical reality is that, while you might have chemical and potentially low-level radiological contamination coming from uranium, it's not nearly the same thing as plutonium or spent fuel, right? And so this is one of the key differences that exist between attacking an enrichment site as opposed to attacking an operating reactor. If you attack an operating reactor, you are going to essentially, depending on what the attack looks like, how it manifests, and that all gets very complicated, potentially result in a significant radioactive event that is going to spray a radioactive plume as a result of all that. Attacking some of the sites like Fordo, attacking Natanz and similar, while that may result in some amount of contamination, as actually the Director General put in his statement, I think it was this morning, primarily that's an issue of ingestion. And so, frankly, if you wear face masks and covers and similar, that's less of an issue. There are chemical corrosion issues, but that is what you're looking at. And in terms of criticality issues, which is kind of what you're speaking to, that shouldn't be a problem given what level of enrichment the Iranians have and the safety protocols that are associated with where the cylinders are and similar. At the same time, if the Iranians are in a crisis situation, and let's say they pile a whole bunch of UF6 cylinders into a truck and are racing across the desert, you can imagine some kind of issues there. But I think a criticality issue where you would have a nuclear weapons explosion is incredibly unlikely. The more likely event for a criticality explosion is if the Iranians are starting to play with nuclear weapons production, and because they are rushing, because they are currently under attack, they do not follow the same kinds of safety protocols that you would have. And criticality events, as you guys know as well as anybody, they are a thing. They have happened. They've happened in the U.S. nuclear weapons program. They have happened in the Soviet nuclear weapons program. I'm not familiar enough with other ones, but I'd be willing to bet they've happened in every single weapons program that's out there because, this is what happens when humans start messing around with nuclear materials.
Yeah. So in the nuclear space, move fast and break things is not the way that you want to move. Kelsey, same question to you, and also, to dig a little deeper, we talked about deeply buried facilities. What does it actually look like to have a full military solution to the Iranian nuclear program? What would that involve to do a military-only approach?
Yeah, so I really agree with Richard. The one area where I think you'd have a slightly more catastrophic impact is if the Israelis somehow decided to bomb the Bushehr power reactor. I think that's extremely unlikely, given that is an energy reactor. It is protected by international law. Also, there are Russians on site at Bushehr. So I think for numerous reasons, that's off the table. And also the regional consequences of attacking that site would be profound. So, I think, like I said, I don't think we'll see that on any targeting list. Getting back to your question, though, a military setback for Fordo, like I said, would probably involve the U.S. dropping multiple successive, precision strike, massive ordnance penetrator bombs, on that site. I mean, I remember, being in Florida about a year and a half ago, talking to a former CENTCOM commander, and he said, as you progress in the military and the more you learn about military plans for trying to strike Iran's nuclear program and destroy Iran's nuclear program, the more you realize what a bad idea it is, how challenging it is, and that really you should be invested in diplomacy and every other measure first, before you get to that. So, like I said, I think, yes, it is possible for the United States to destroy Fordow, but it is extremely challenging. And I said, by this point, there's already a risk Iran has moved things, out of that facility. So I don't think really we can say that there is a military solution to this, conflict. I mean, setback, yes, but again, possibly driving proliferation risk in the long term by both creating more of a political incentive, to go for a bomb, but also by creating a lot of technical uncertainties based on how Iran is responding to, the Israeli strikes and the possibility of those continuing to strike the nuclear facilities.
A difficult question, and this has come up a lot in the chat. What is the worst case scenario that you see from this? And I'm guessing I know what it is, but let me get your assessment on the worst case scenario, and then I'll follow up. Kelsey, we'll start with you.
Oh gosh, I mean, there's a lot of ways that this could get. I mean, this is already bad. I mean, civilians are being killed in this conflict. It's tragic. But yes, it could get a lot worse. I mean, I would flag, a few things. I mean, first, I think, just from a proliferation perspective, the IAEA gets back into some of these facilities, can't account for all the nuclear material. There's a lot more uncertainty about whether Iran is moving towards a bomb. I think that's problematic. Relatedly, the Iranian Majlis is already discussing now a bill that would require Iran to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Treaty withdrawal doesn't necessarily mean weaponization, but I think that would be extremely damaging to the overarching non-proliferation regime, and create more space if Iran did decide it wanted to develop nuclear weapons. So a lot of possibilities to get worse on the proliferation front. And that's, aside from Iran deciding that it wants to build nuclear weapons, which I think also is certainly problematic. But like I said, there's a lot of ways, too, that this conflict right now that is more contained to exchanges between Iran and Israel could regionalize. I mean, an erroneous missile strike on that falls, on another state in the region that hits a U.S. asset. I think there are a lot of ways that this could escalate to a broader regional war. And I mean, I don't need to list the reasons why I think that would be, certainly, deeply troubling and quite worrisome, not only from a security perspective, but just, the broader humanitarian impacts of a conflict like that. So I think a lot of reasons to be worried, unfortunately.
Richard, your worst case scenario?
Yeah, my worst case scenario is that the Iranians test nuclear weapons in a week. I mean, and again, the timelines are something that we've already talked about. There's tremendous uncertainty, but it is not remotely beyond Iran's capacity to both enrich up to 90%, turn the material into metal, to put them into a device and test, and/or try and deploy something crude across a dhow that goes across the Straits of Hormuz. I mean, there are a number of different variants in which these strikes don't stop the Iranians from crossing those lines, but instead are a starting pistol for them doing so. And that's kind of regardless of whether or not the Iranians always intended to have nuclear weapons or not. I mean, you can set that question aside for a moment, because to some extent it doesn't matter. Now we're in a space of their technical capacities are where they are, and they have been given every strategic reason in the universe to move down that direction. And if I am a national security advisor sitting in Tehran right now, and I'm asked by the supreme leader, what should we do? I find it very hard to say, well, we should keep this one on the shelf because the international norms say we should. And I think this is my worst case scenario that metastasizes in other spaces, because the to the extent that this campaign fails, it will be a demonstration that a diplomatic approach to a nuclear proliferation scenario was unsuccessful. Whether or not it could have been successful if it had been left alone is something that I'm sure we would leave. We could have a long discussion about, and my views on the JCPOA are incredibly well known. But, setting that on fire was a direct contribution to where we are today. A military solution that doesn't prevent proliferation also undermines the cause about proliferation. And the fact that a military campaign was tried and failed, notwithstanding all these efforts, also contributes to a proliferation path, because countries say the only way I can protect myself is if I go down this path. So regional proliferation is a massive problem. Future diplomatic outcomes with proliferators is a massive problem. And the more states that we have with nuclear weapons, the greater the incentive structure is there. So I think all of those things add up in their own right, on top of the proliferation challenges that Kelsey spoke to about, materials going missing and so on and so forth. And when you add those up with then the threat of conflict across the straits, whether or not it's inadvertent or not, the implications that has for the global economy, the ramifications of this conflict are potentially quite severe. And this is part of the reason why it's important to understand what the path to solution is. If the path to solution that the Israelis have identified is regime change, then this is going to go on for quite some time. If they see regime change as an incidental benefit as opposed to the objective in its own right, okay, that gives us some space to try and either find a diplomatic solution or find ways in which there are military ways to address elements of the program, even if you can't have confidence. But understanding how this ends and having a very clear understanding of what the Israeli position of how this ends is still absolutely essential. And candidly, I don't think we have it right now.
All right. More to dig in on there, but I'm gonna toss a tough one at you, because that's why you get paid the big bucks. John Saropoulos from Al Jazeera is asking, do you believe that the U.S. winked at Netanyahu and allowed him to go ahead, or are we in a new foreign policy era in which Israel, which has been constrained from carrying out direct strikes on Iran's facilities, is no longer listening to the United States? So Kelsey, we'll start with you. Very, very easy one.
I mean, I think that President Trump has been very clear in his opposition to the use of military force against Iran while diplomacy was playing out. And reporting suggests that he pushed back against Netanyahu. Some of this even confirmed publicly, multiple times when it looked like Netanyahu was preparing for military strikes, earlier this year. That being said, the Trump administration is not consistent in its messaging. Could Israel have interpreted something as a wink? Perhaps. But again, I think the more likely scenario is, as Richard said, Israel was worried that diplomacy would succeed, that it would mean a deal that it did not view as kind of matching its interests and objectives regarding Iran, and wanted to disrupt that process. And, another point that I would make too, I think, Richard raised the excellent point about, understanding Israel's objectives. And I think it just has to be said here that, regime change is not an assured non-proliferation strategy, right? We don't know what would come next in Iran if this regime were to fall. If it were the military seizing control, nuclear weapons might be more likely. But even if it were, a more open, democratic government, democracies choose to build nuclear weapons too. And in an environment where a new state feels like its interests are at risk, nuclear weapons could be more attractive. Right? So I think, if you're worried about Iran developing nuclear weapons, which I think we all should be, we should not think that regime change is going to address that problem.
Richard?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with the last point. And I think the chances of regime change, actually contributing, or at least making efforts towards it, contributing to a weaponization decision, are certainly there. And, this is what puts us back to the reason why there was a diplomatic option that was on the table that was being pursued and that people thought made a whole ton of sense. I'll just say I think that the Trump administration's position on this has definitely been inconsistent, but over the course of the last week, or you maybe even go back a couple of months, it's actually been relatively consistent, which is we want to see if we can get to a deal, and we think a deal is possible. I think it is that consistency that's actually been the thing that's the problem. If you're staring at from Bibi Netanyahu's viewpoint, that you see the possibility of a deal being done, even if that is inconsistent with what your desires are, or frankly, that the process would take forever. Even if there was a framework deal that would emerge, that framework deal probably wasn't going to resolve anything anytime soon. It just simply means more time for the Iranians to rearm and similar. So, I mean, on the idea of whether or not Trump winked at a decision or not, I think based on everything we've seen in public, I think there was no overt wink, if an overt wink is a thing. But there absolutely was a pretty clear statement, don't do this. And Rubio's comments, we had nothing to do with this, don't hurt me, effectively were the same sort of line. And so it's only after the fact when we've seen attacks, being successful that we've seen Trump, kind of lean into it. Query if we saw something, negative start to develop, whether or not Trump would maintain that same position, because we know that he likes to be on the side of winners. To the extent that he perceives the Israelis as winners right now, that is the reason why he is maintaining his position and why I think we have a wink. In 2 weeks' time, if the Iranians are preparing for a nuclear weapons test, or they've told the world they have 90% and they're about to withdraw from the NPT, or any of these other scenarios that we can hypothesize, those are the kinds of things where I think that wink will be pulled back.
So this is only one part, this latest back and forth of a long issue in the region with regards to weapons of mass destruction. So Kelsey, can you talk a little bit about the perennial discussion at the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty review process about the establishment of a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the whole Middle East, what that would do? And then Richard, since you bear the scars of diplomatic life, maybe talk about why it's been so hard to have that discussion. So Kelsey first.
Sure. So as part of the 1995 decision to indefinitely extend the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, there was, a resolution that called for the establishment of a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. This would include not only the weapons themselves, but also delivery systems. Unlike other zones, it's not just nuclear weapons. It would include biological, chemical. There have been some efforts to try to advance this zone over the years, most notably at the 2010 NPT review conference. There was a requirement in there that a conference be held on establishing the zone by 2012. There were some consultations. The conference didn't happen. So this is a long way of saying this idea has a long and tortured history. It is extremely complex, both technically, but also politically. I think it's fair to say that there are some states in the region who like to use non-progress on this issue for political means. And to be frank, this is not the solution to the Iranian nuclear crisis that is happening today, right? I mean, making progress on this, should it still be a goal? Sure, I think it would be beneficial, but there's a lot of work that has to be done, and Iran is an urgent crisis today.
Richard, thoughts on why this hasn't worked, or whether or not prospects might be increased or decreased based on the current situation?
Oh, I think prospects can't really decrease because they're basically at zero anyway. I mean, we might be in sub-zero, kind of territory. I mean, I think that the reason why, though, goes back to the fundamental security dilemma that exists, and those dilemma are not just between states, but people in those countries having perceptions of security dilemma that are incredibly intense. And again, if you are looking at, for instance, the Israeli population, the Israeli government, both the sense of threat that they have from conventional attacks that have been mounted against them, as well as going back, to the Holocaust, the perception of security and insecurity, more importantly, is incredibly real. And not only can I not dissuade anyone from having that perspective, I don't think it's my right to try and dissuade people from having it. The whole rationale of these free zones was attempted to replace the insecurity dilemma with security confidence by everyone being at the same level. But that's where enters the problem of cheating and cheating on the various different systems. And the reality is that the IEA does exceptional work where it has the authorities to do so, but it didn't have the authorities to do what it needed to do in Iraq until after the additional protocol existed. Libya was out on the open market getting nuclear weapons kit from AQ Khan, as in fact were the Iranians, and cheating on the non-proliferation obligations in the first place. And as an Israeli official once said to me, he said, we will have confidence in these systems when these systems are proven to work, but they don't. And these systems work in places where you don't have the same sort of insecurity. Now, I think anyone on this call could have debates over whether or not we could be doing things more to improve the systems. But the reality is that where we've had cheating, particularly on them, have been localized in this space, and that creates the security dilemma that we're at. And then you've got all the politics that come into that too. So my great hope is at some point, one of these crises is going to let people say, maybe we don't want to do this anymore. But I think the much more realistic scenario, as Kelsey is saying, is that, we're kind of stuck here while states have both the political and the security anxieties that they have. I think there was some hope that the Abraham Accords and that process would move us towards that, something that's a little bit more conducive. If you could find more states willing to coexist, it actually puts pressure on the outliers to some extent. Whether or not we can get back there, it's both the resolution of this problem, which I agree with Kelsey is not going to be through a weapons-free zone kind of space, but frankly, it's also not having a zero-sum approach as others do when they look at this problem, and saying we're not going to get progress on the CTBT, or we're not going to make progress on CWC until after we've solved all the problems. Well, look, that doesn't help us either.
Yeah, we have to solve everything before we can solve anything is a problem that we've long dealt with in the nuclear space. I want to end sort of in an up note, just an amazing amount of questions. I wish we had more time, but you guys have both studied this issue for so long. Really appreciate the insights here. If you were to give world leaders, and particularly the one here in Washington, a piece of advice as the days and weeks move forward on how to handle this, what would be your piece of advice? Kelsey, we'll start with you.
Boy, I mean, I would say to President Trump, absent clear evidence of weaponization, don't get dragged in, don't let the United States get dragged into this conflict. Continue to push for de-escalation and start thinking about what a post-conflict diplomatic path forward looks like. Sorry, that was more than one, but
no, it was good. It was brief. Richard?
I'm not sure I fully agree with that. I mean, look, I think the problem right now is we're all in our assumptions. We can assume that the Iranians aren't breaking out. We can assume that they are. The problem is we don't have any facts to support that and substantiate it either way. And as Kelsey was saying earlier, it's really hard to imagine the IEA being able to go in and take a look at anything. And you can't fully trust what you're seeing on intel, right? And a lot of that intel is not going to be discrete, at least enough at this point. I think if I was going to say anything to him, it'd be very clear-eyed about what you're trying to achieve and what you need to achieve to address this problem. The idea that you need to have regime change in order to get to resolution of this is probably not true. And so there is space potentially to deal even with this government, as distasteful as that can be, given other things the government's involved in, to keep the existential threat that Iran could potentially present, both to countries in the region, potentially others, fully in mind. But also be very clear-eyed about the uncertainties that exist here too. And so that they're going to come with a diplomatic outcome, they're going to come with a military outcome. The number one thing is remember that these decisions are being reached by you on behalf of the United States, as opposed to being dragged in by any particular party or being compelled to do so or to take actions against that as well. Keep that focus on what we're in a position to actually do or not necessarily what other people would like us to do.
Both great pieces of advice. That's all the time we have for today. Clearly, so much more to discuss. In the chat, you'll see links to the articles that we have on Iran, on Israel, on this conflict. and more to follow. The best way to stay engaged is to follow us on social media, sign up for our newsletter. Thank you to the individuals and foundation donors who make these programs possible. Today's event will be available to watch on YouTube, so please do share it with others in your network. And finally, thanks to Kelsey and Richard for, again, sharing your extra expertise, doing double duty on this. I imagine we'll probably be back to ask for your sage advice and wisdom on these issues again, and especially for your time during this busy period. I know you've both been, burning the candle at both ends since Thursday night. So thanks to you all, and we hope to see you for our next program. Thank you.